the Tawheed or monotheism of Islam. So through the question, when they say, what do you worship? Whether they say, did you worship a black box or who is Allah? Regardless of the question, it gives us the opportunity to expound on it, to open up who is Allah and how do we worship Him. The name itself means the only one worthy to be worshipped. That is Allah's name. And it works really nice when we break it down and show them how they can understand this. Now, when we talk about our comparison to what they have, it's important for us to remember we should never attack their beliefs. And we don't need to attack them. Let them hear what we have and let them make their own assessment. That's strong enough. When you show the truth of Islam, you don't need to attack somebody else's belief. They'll attack it themselves. The common sense, God is one. He has no partners. For a person who follows the Judaism, the religion of Jewish, or for the Christian, they say God is one. This is in their book. It actually says to them real clear, to know, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, one Lord. It also tells them that you shall not make any partners with God. Thou shalt not have any other gods beside me. All of this points in the same direction that Islam is talking about one God. So this is very important. Another thing that we find is that they'll ask you, what about this God you have, this Allah? Is that the same God of Abraham? We don't think so. They'll say that. They'll say we don't believe it because this is not the God of the Bible. This is not the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament. Some have even argued that this is something that was made up later. There was no word Allah until Muhammad ﷺ came along and made it up. This is actually in some scholarly works presented, not in most of them, of course, in the West. But in fact, there's a simple answer for that. There are Arab Jews today, and there are Arab Christians, just as there were at the time of Muhammad ﷺ, and just as there were at the time of Jesus. Peace and blessing be upon him. I want you to think about this. If there's a Bible in the Arabic language, what would be the word that they use for God? That would prove it right there. And by the way, I have two, and you're welcome to check it out for yourself. You can go to any hotel or motel in the West, and there's a free Bible placed there by the Gideon Society. Take it out, open it up. In the very beginning of it, they're real proud of the fact that they've translated this word, God, and the message of God into all these different languages. The first language that they give an example of is the Afrikaans language. The second one they give an example of is called the Arabic language. And you can see it for yourself because they're translating the verse from John 3:16 that says, for God so loved the world, etc. You read it right there in the Arabic and it says it, Allah. Alif Lam Lam Ha. The same is true of the Old Testament for the Jews. And I have looked at it myself. And on page 1 in the book of Genesis, I counted the word Allah 17 times. So if this is something new, it's made up, how come it's there in the Jewish book? How come it's already there in the Christian book? And in fact, this is the same name that was used by Jews and Christians at the time of Muhammad. And it was understood that when they said Allah, they meant the one and only God. This was clear to them as it should be to all of us. Now, this gives us a chance to introduce the subject of who is Allah. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is how do we worship Him. So we want you to stay tuned with us here on Clearing the Fog, Lifting the Fog, getting rid of the misconceptions of Islam and the message that comes with it. Stay tuned for more right here. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. This is the second part of our program in dealing with the subject of clearing away these misconceptions or lifting the fog with regard to the subject of who do we actually worship. And I want to give you now the example of what really did happen to us one time with this question about Muslims worshiping a black box in the desert. I was giving a talk similar to the one that I've been talking about here in a masjid in Toronto, Canada. after the talk, a gentleman came up to me and he said, listen, I want to ask you a question. Why is it you Muslims worship this black box in the desert? And I said, whoa, let's start from the beginning. And I actually went through the steps and asked the Muslims to listen how we answer the question. And I said to him, thank you for asking us about our religion. First of all, in Islam, we must always tell the truth, because if we don't, we can go to hell forever. The second thing is that we have the proof. Everything in Islam is recorded, it's documented, and it's preserved in authentic form so that there's no question about what was really taught 1,400 years ago. And finally, a lot of times we have to clear up the question before we can answer it because it may contain within it something that's, well, incorrect. So we'll begin with that. And by the way, while you're listening to the answer, if you hear something that you said, gee, I didn't know that, or if you find yourself saying, gee, I like that for me, this is something nice, and I can relate to that, then my question to you would be, are you going to be prepared then to consider worshiping your Lord and your God alone without any partners? Because you see, that's all Islam is really about anyway. The gentleman looked at me and he said, huh? I said, yes. I'm just telling you that while you listen to the answer, if you find things that you really like, are you going to be prepared then to consider worshiping God, your God, on His terms? That's what Islam is about. He said, okay, go ahead. So then I give him the answer. And I began like this, by explaining that first and foremost, who is Allah? As we mentioned in the first part of the segment of this particular program today. We talked about who is Allah and why we worship Him alone. He has no partners. Then I came to the part about the black box. The black box is actually a place in the desert that's been constructed a long time ago and then maintained for century after century by the various tribes and descendants of Ishmael. He was surprised to learn that we know about Ishmael. I said, oh, of course. You see, Islam is teaching us about the sons of Abraham. Abraham has two sons, Ishaq, or Isaac as you call him, and Ismail, or Ishmael, as is mentioned in the Bible. These two sons are both descendants of Abraham. And both of them are predicted in the Bible to have many generations, many of their children. As many as the sand of the sea and as many as the stars in the heaven. And this is comparing one to the other. He agrees with me. He goes, yeah, and? I said, okay. So just in the same way that we realize that Isaac had many descendants that came from him, and these are the ones that are referred to as the chosen to receive guidance, or the Yahud. So in the same way is Ishmael, or Ismail. He has also many descendants. When Abraham took his son Ishmael to the desert with his mother, who we call her Hajar, and you call her Hagar in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. When they went to the desert, there was a place there, a specific place that was built up, that they built upon it this house of Allah, or Kaaba. And this has been maintained ever since until this very day. He said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, well, that's okay. Let me explain, too, that that's not the only house of Allah. There were other places where people worship God. And the Old Testament is famous for mentioning these booths that were set up for the prophets to worship there in these particular places. And one of the most famous that you may be familiar with is Jerusalem itself, when people used to all face toward Jerusalem, and Jews today still face toward Jerusalem for their worship. Now, there's another one in the New Testament. You may not be familiar with it by its correct name in Arabic, but you'll recognize it right away with the English version. Bethlehem. Beit Lehem. Which means what? It's meaning a slaughterhouse. The house of flesh or meat. And that was where Jesus, peace be upon him, was born, was into this city, which was well known for its slaughterhouses. So this gives us an idea now that sometimes we hear words that we think that are some kind of sacred thing, and it's just explaining a place. And the same is true for the place that we worship God in the desert. You call it the black box or the cube, and we're saying that we don't worship God there in it, but we direct our worship to God by facing that way.